The dust of redemption settled in a man's throat like a final prayer. It coated the clapboard buildings, the weary horses tethered to hitching posts, and the soul of Boone Delaney. He stood outside the general store, the weight of supplies in his burlap sack, a poor counter to the hollowness in his chest. The sun beat down with the weight of a blacksmith's hammer, relentless and unforgiving, a perfect mirror for the world as he now knew it. He was a man running from ghosts, the ghosts of cannon fire, the ghosts of fallen comrades, and the sharper, more personal ghosts of a mother's smile and a father's laugh, silenced by a night of violence he could never fully piece together. The ranch he'd just purchased sight unseen was his final gambit for peace, a fortress of solitude in a valley no one wanted. He was turning to mount his horse when the world exploded. Glass shattered from the bank across the street, a glittering spray of desperation. A woman screamed a raw, piercing sound that cut through the midday stupor. Men in dusty coats poured from the bank's entrance pistols, barking at the sky. They moved with a practiced, brutal efficiency. People scattered, diving behind water troughs and into alleyways. The world narrowed to chaos and fear. Boone's hand went to the Colt peacemaker on his hip, an old familiar reflex. But he held his ground, his eyes scanning the scene with the cold assessment of a soldier. This wasn't his fight. He was done with fights. He was just passing through. Then he saw the leader. The man was taller than the others, moving with an unnerving calm amidst the pandemonium. He wasn't wearing a bandana over his face, a show of brazen confidence that was both arrogant and terrifying. He had a handsome, chiseled face, eyes as pale and cold as a winter sky, and a charismatic smile that didn't reach them. He stepped onto the boardwalk, a heavy satchel of money in one hand, and surveyed his work with the satisfaction of an artist. And then Boone saw it. Swinging from a leather cord around the man's neck was a silver locket. It was oval-shaped, intricately engraved with a pair of nesting doves. As the man turned, the locket caught the sun, glinting with a sharp, blinding light that felt like a physical blow. It was his mother's locket. A one-of-a-kind gift from his father, stolen from her body the night they were murdered 15 years ago. The night his world had ended. Time seemed to stop. The shouts, the gunfire, the screams, it all faded into a dull roar. The universe had contracted to that single point of light, that impossible piece of silver. The ghosts he had run from had just been given a face. The leader, feeling Boone's stare, turned his head. Their eyes met across the dusty street. The man's smile widened, a flicker of cruel amusement in his gaze, as if he knew something Boone didn't. He gave a mock salute with the barrel of his pistol, then swung into his saddle. "Ride," he commanded, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was chillingly out of place. His gang spurred their horses, thundering out of town in a cloud of dust and stolen hope. Boone stood frozen, his knuckles white where he gripped the burlap sack. The town marshal and a few brave citizens finally emerged, firing uselessly after the retreating riders. But Boone didn't see them. He only saw the locket. The past wasn't dead. It wasn't even past. It had a name, and it had just ridden out of town with his family's legacy around its neck. He learned the name an hour later from the shaken bank teller. Silas Kane, the man, whispered, his face ashen. Heard them call him that. Polite as you please right before he put a pistol to my head. Said he was acquiring assets for a new venture. Silas Kane. The name meant nothing and everything. Boone's retreat to the valley was no longer an escape. It was a strategic withdrawal. The isolation he had sought for peace would now be used for preparation. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a watchtower. He would go to this empty land, this place of ghosts, and he would wait. Because a man like Silas Kane, a man who wore his sins like a trophy, would not disappear forever. And when he resurfaced, Boone would be ready. He rode out of redemption, not towards peace, but towards a reckoning he now knew was inevitable. The valley was a scar of green, carved into the red rock desert, a place where the sun reigned supreme and silence was a physical presence. The Delaney Ranch sat in its heart, a collection of weathered buildings slowly surrendering to the elements. The main house sagged like a tired old man, its windows vacant eyes staring out at a world that had forgotten it. This was the silence Boone had paid for, a quiet so profound he could hear the beat of his own heart, a steady rhythmic drumming that counted down the seconds until his past came calling. His first days were a blur of hard labor, a balm for a restless mind. He mended fences that snaked through the tall grass like skeletal remains, cleared a decade of dust and decay from the barn, and wrestled the overgrown landscape back from the brink of wilderness. He worked until his muscles screamed, and his mind was too numb to think of a silver locket or a pair of cold winter blue eyes. On the third morning, he found the footprints. They were small and delicate, pressed into the damp earth near the well made by someone who moved with the weightless grace of a phantom. They led from the dense line of pines at the edge of his property, circled the house in a wide, cautious arc, and vanished back into the trees. He wasn't alone. The thought sent a jolt through him, a mix of soldierly alertness and a strange, unwelcome curiosity. He followed the tracks to the forest's edge, his rifle held loosely in his hand. He scanned the deep, cathedral-like shadows between the ancient pines. Nothing. The forest was still holding its breath. He was about to turn back when a flicker of movement caught his eye. There, half hidden behind the massive trunk of an oak, stood a young woman. She was frozen like a deer caught in a hunter's sights, her body taut with terror. Her hair was the color of sun-bleached wheat, and her eyes, wide and luminous, were fixed on him. The moment their gazes locked, she was gone. She didn't run so much as evaporate into the trees, a silent, desperate flight that left only the rustle of leaves in her wake. Boone didn't follow. He was a hunter of men, not frightened girls. But the image of her stayed with him, a puzzle in a place he had assumed was devoid of them. That evening, as the sun bled across the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, he found a loaf of bread on his porch steps. It was still warm, wrapped in a clean linen cloth. The same small footprints were there in the dust, a clear message left in his absence. She had approached his fortress, his sanctuary, while he was tending to his horse in the barn. She had left a gift and retreated. It made no sense. Why would someone so terrified of him risk coming so close? It was a gesture of peace, of welcome from a ghost who feared being seen. The bread was hearty and well-made, laced with herbs he couldn't name. It tasted of a care and attention to detail that felt utterly alien in this harsh, forgotten place. The next morning brought a new mystery. The night before, his horse, Atlas, had stepped on a sharp rock, leaving a shallow but painful cut on its front hoof. He had planned to tend to it at first light, but when he entered the barn, he found the hoof had already been cleaned with an expert's touch and bound with a neat bandage of torn cloth. His water barrel, which had been nearly empty, was now filled to the brim with clear, cold water from the mountain stream a half-mile away. Someone was watching him, tending to his needs from the shadows. A silent guardian who understood his life without a single word being exchanged. The valley was not empty. It was inhabited by a silent, benevolent spirit who moved like the wind and cared for a stranger she was too afraid to meet. This place he had chosen for its emptiness was proving to be anything but. And somewhere in those deep, silent woods, a woman was keeping secrets, and he was beginning to feel a desperate need to understand. On the third morning of these strange visitations, Boone awoke to a profound sense of unease. He had slept soundly, exhausted from his labor, but the air in the small ranch house felt different, subtly altered. His boots, which he had kicked off haphazardly by the door, now sat perfectly aligned side by side. The wool blanket he had tossed over a chair was folded with a precision that reminded him of the barracks. Most unnerving of all, the loose floorboard near the hearth that had creaked under his weight for days was now solid. He knelt and saw that a new piece of wood had been expertly fitted and secured from below the grain, matched so perfectly it was almost invisible. Someone had been inside his house while he slept. They hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't left a threat. They had tidied. They had fixed things. Boone stood, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was a man who had survived 3 years of war by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were screaming. But this wasn't the familiar chill of danger. It was something else entirely, something far more unsettling. It felt like being cared for by an invisible hand, observed by an unseen eye, that knew his needs better than he did. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a violation, a quiet invasion of his carefully constructed solitude. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, his eyes sweeping the tree line where the woman had vanished. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and something else, a faint, warm domestic aroma. Baking bread, perhaps. But there was no smoke, no sign of any other dwelling in the entire vast expanse of the valley. "I know you're out there." He called out, his voice, a rough intrusion into the sacred silence. It echoed off the distant canyon walls, returning to him unanswered. "I'm not going to hurt you." Silence, then a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as a falling leaf, the sharp snap of a twig underfoot. Boone's gaze locked onto a space between 2 towering pines, where the shadows seemed deeper, more substantial. He took a slow step off the porch, then another, his boots making no sound in the soft dirt. He moved with the predatory patience of a man who knew how to hunt. "My name is Boone Delaney," he said, keeping his voice low and even. He lowered his rifle slightly, a gesture of peace, but kept it ready. "This is my land now, bought and paid for. But I'm willing to share." The shadow between the trees resolved itself into a human form. It was her. The woman from 2 days ago, but closer now. She stood with her back pressed against the rough bark of a pine, one hand gripping it for support. He could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the tremble in her hands. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps barely out of her teens, with a fragile beauty that seemed ill-suited to such a wild place. Her dress was simple homespun, but immaculately clean. It was her posture that struck him most, the way she held herself as if trying to occupy as little space in the world as possible. She had been taught to be invisible. "Can you speak?" Boone asked gently. Her lips parted a soft, pale line in her frightened face. A small, choked sound escaped, but no words. She shook her head, a barely perceptible motion, and pressed herself harder against the tree. Her eyes darted to a point somewhere over his shoulder, a look of renewed panic on her face. Boone glanced back. He saw only his own lonely house, the barn, the vast, empty valley beyond. It was a calculated distraction. When he turned back to the tree line, she was gone. But she had left something behind. On a fallen log that lay between where they had both stood, a single white wildflower had been carefully placed. And carved into the bark of the pine tree, where she had hidden the sap still fresh and weeping from the cuts, were 2 words that made Boone's blood run cold. "Help me." He spent the rest of the day in a state of agitated vigilance, the 2 carved words burning in his mind. Help with what? From whom? The silent offerings of bread and aid were now cast in a sinister new light. They weren't gifts. They were pleas. He searched the woods, following faint game trails that crisscrossed the forest floor. But the land was a maze of streams and thick undergrowth that swallowed tracks whole. He called out her name, a name he didn't even know, but only the echo answered. Still he felt her. He felt eyes on his back, a presence that melted away the moment he turned. She was watching him, testing him. By late afternoon, frustration had gnawed at him until it became a raw ache in his gut. He returned to the ranch house, his search fruitless. He found an old woman sitting in his rocking chair on the porch as if she had been waiting for him all her life. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that tolerated no stray strands. Her face was a roadmap of hard years, but her eyes were the color of a winter sky, sharp and intelligent, and missing nothing. She wore a simple, practical black dress, and her hands, though wrinkled and work-worn, were folded in her lap, with an air of absolute authority. When she looked at him, Boone felt as though she were weighing his very soul, and finding it wanting. "You're the man who bought this land," she stated. It was not a question. Her voice was gravelly, carrying the weight of pronouncements, not conversations. "Boone Delaney." He said, his hand resting near his Colt. He did not lower his rifle. "And you are?" "Iris Quaid. I take care of things in this valley." The chair creaked a slow, rhythmic protest as she rocked. "You've been disturbing the peace." "Whose peace?" Boone countered. "There's a girl in these woods. She seems to think she's the one being disturbed." Iris's rocking stilled. A flicker of something surprise, or perhaps fear, crossed her stoic features. "There is a girl. Willa. She's been here since she was a child. She's under my protection, and I don't take kindly to strangers with rifles frightening her. She carved, 'Help me,' into a tree." Boone said, his voice flat. "Sounds to me like she needs protection from her protector." Iris's face hardened. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "That's impossible. Willa doesn't communicate with men. Not ever. The world of men is a serpent, Mr. Delaney. It offers an apple, but its bite is poison. Why isn't it safe for her? Because some wounds are passed down through the blood. Because innocence is a treasure that once stolen can never be recovered." Iris stood, her joints creaking like old leather. She was not a tall woman, but she projected an aura of unshakable conviction. "You seem a decent enough man for a man. So take my advice. Forget the girl. Find a wife in town, build your fences, and raise your cattle. But leave Willa Blaine to her silence. It is the only shield she has." She walked toward the tree line, her back ramrod straight. At the edge of the forest, she turned a silhouette against the deepening shadows. "And Mr. Delaney?" She called out, her voice carrying a final chilling warning. "Start locking your door at night. These woods are not as empty as they look." She melted into the forest, leaving Boone alone on his porch, the silence of the valley rushing back in to fill the space she had occupied. He had a name now. Willa. And he had a warden. Iris. Despite her talk of protection, it was clear that Iris Quaid was not a guardian. She was a jailer. And her prisoner was beginning to test the bars of her cage. That night, for the first time, Boone bolted his door. But sleep was a distant country he couldn't reach. He stood by the window, the moon-drenched yard, a stage of silver and shadow, and he waited. Around midnight, she appeared. A pale ghost drifting from the trees, Willa moved with a dreamlike grace toward his house. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He held his breath, a silent observer in his own home. She didn't stop at the porch steps, as she had before. She sat down, unwrapped the bundle, and spread a piece of paper on her lap. By the stark silver light of the moon, she began to write, her hand moving with a slow, careful deliberation. When she finished, she folded the paper, placed it under a small, smooth stone by his door, and then she did something that made the air leave his lungs. She leaned back against the porch post and looked directly at his window. Their eyes met through the glass. There was no fear in her expression this time, only a silent, powerful acknowledgement. She knew he was there. She wanted him to be. It was an invitation. The next morning, the note was exactly where she had left it. The handwriting was elegant, beautiful, but with a slight tremor, as if the hand that held the pen was unaccustomed to the task. My name is Willa Blaine. I have lived in these woods for 12 years. Iris says men are dangerous, that they hurt women like my mother was hurt. But you seem different. You mended the fence by the creek. You scatter grain for the wild birds. You speak gently even when you are alone. I think Iris might be wrong about you. But I cannot speak to you. She says if I ever use my voice with a man, a terrible thing will happen. To both of us. She has never told me what. But I carved those words because I want to know. I want to know what it feels like to have a conversation, to ask a question and hear an answer, to laugh with someone besides myself. Boone read the letter 3 times, a slow burn of anger rising in his chest. This young woman, vibrant and intelligent, had been sentenced to a life of silence and fear, based on a vague, unsubstantiated threat. The sheer injustice of it made his hands tremble. He went inside, found a pencil stub, and on the back of her letter wrote his reply. Dear Willa, thank you for your words. Iris may mean well, but keeping you from the world is not protection. It is a prison. You deserve to know why you are hidden. You deserve to make your own choices about who is safe and who is not. I will be by the creek at sunset. If you come, I promise to answer any question you have. I will ask for nothing in return but the chance to hear your voice. If you do not come, I will understand. He placed the letter back under the stone. The rest of the day was an exercise in strained patience. He worked, but his mind was elsewhere. His eyes kept straying to the tree line, wondering if she had found his reply, wondering if she would find the courage to defy the only law she had ever known. As the sun began its descent, bathing the valley in a warm, golden light, Boone walked to the creek that bordered his property. He sat on a smooth, flat rock and waited. He had no idea if she would come. But as the sky deepened to orange and purple, a profound feeling settled over him, a sense that his life and hers was about to change forever. She emerged from a thicket of willows on the opposite bank, just as the last rays of sunlight vanished. In the gloaming, she looked ethereal, her pale dress making her seem like a spirit of the dusk. But there was a new resolve in her posture, a straightness to her spine that spoke of a decision made, of a fear confronted. They stood 20 feet apart at the babbling creek, a liquid boundary between them. Her hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was little more than a whisper, fragile and laced with the dust of disuse. I have never spoken to a man before. The simple words struck Boone with the force of a physical blow. Her voice was softer than he could have imagined, with a slight musical tremor. But beneath the fear, he heard a fierce, desperate curiosity. Then I am honored to be the first, Boone said, keeping his own voice low, unthreatening. How does it feel? She considered the question, her head tilted slightly. Strange. Like breaking a law I never understood. She took a tentative step closer to the water's edge. Your letter said I deserve to know why I am hidden. Do you believe that? I do. Everyone deserves the truth of their own life. Iris says my mother was attacked by a man when I was small. that she died because she trusted the wrong person. She says the same will happen to me." Boone's jaw clenched. "Did Iris tell you this from her own knowledge? Did she see it happen?" "No. I was too young to remember anything. But she shows me the grave sometimes. A small, unmarked stone up on the ridge. To remind me." Willa's voice grew stronger, clearer, as if the act of speaking were strengthening the muscle of it. "She says all men take what they want and leave women broken. But you have been here for days. You have taken nothing. You have only given back. You are not what she said you would be." Her gaze was direct, searching. "What if she is wrong about you? What if some men can be trusted?" Before Boone could answer, the sharp crack of a breaking branch echoed from the woods behind her. Both of them froze their eyes, locking across the creek. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were approaching. "She followed me." Willa whispered, the color draining from her face. "She always follows me." Iris Quaid burst from the tree line like an avenging fury. Her gray hair had come loose, framing her face in a wild mane, and her eyes blazed with a righteous fire. In her hands, she held an old, long-barreled hunting rifle, and it was pointed directly at Boone's chest. "Step away from him," Willa Iris commanded, her voice shaking with rage. "Now!" But Willa didn't move. Instead, a remarkable transformation occurred. Her fear seemed to fall away, replaced by a cold, quiet anger. She straightened her shoulders and met Iris's furious gaze without flinching. When she spoke, her voice was not the whisper of moments before. It was clear, steady, and resonant. "No." The single word hung in the twilight air, a declaration of war. Iris's face contorted, shock warring with rage. Her grip on the rifle tightened, her thumb nudging the hammer back with an audible click. "You do not understand what you are doing," Child Iris hissed. "You are repeating your mother's mistake." "Then tell me," Willa challenged, taking another step toward the creek, toward Boone. "Tell me the truth, Iris. What was my mother's mistake? And how did she really die?" The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the murmur of the creek. Iris's hands trembled, but her aim remained fixed on Boone's heart. "Your mother, Iris," began, her voice cracking with the weight of old grief, "trusted a man who promised her the world. A handsome charmer who said all the right words. Men always do." "His name," Willa demanded. "Thomas Garrett. A drifter. He talked of marriage, of a new life in California. He got her with child, and then he was gone. Took every penny she had and left her to face the town's scorn alone." "But you said she died because she trusted him," Willa pressed, her voice insistent. "How did she die, Iris?" Iris's composure finally shattered. The rifle lowered slightly, her shoulders slumping. "The winter you were born was the worst in memory. The town turned its back on her. She tried to survive alone in a line cabin on the mountain." Her voice broke on a sob. "She froze to death 3 days after you were born. I found you both after the storm passed, crying in her cold arms." The story hung in the air, brutal and tragic. Willa wrapped her arms around herself, swaying slightly, as if from a physical blow. So she wasn't attacked. She was abandoned. "The result is the same." Iris snarled, raising the rifle again, her grief reconsolidating into fury. "Men lie, men take, men leave, and women pay the price. I will not let that happen to you." "But I am not my mother," Willa said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "And he is not Thomas Garrett." Boone finally spoke, his own voice, carefully controlled, measured. "Mrs. Quaid, I understand why you're afraid. But punishing Willa for a crime she didn't commit isn't protection. You know nothing. I know what I see, Boone countered gently. I see a 20-year-old woman who has never had a single conversation with half the human race. You haven't saved her from pain. You've just built her a different kind of prison. Willa was staring at Boone with an expression of dawning wonder. For the first time in her life, someone was fighting for her right to choose. I want to hear his voice, she said, her words directed at Iris, but her eyes on Boone. I want to know what it feels like to be treated like a woman, not a fragile child. Over my dead body, Iris whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger. In a movement so swift and decisive, it took them both by surprise. Willa stepped forward, crossing through the shallow creek until she stood directly between the rifle and Boone. Water streamed from the hem of her dress. Then you'll have to shoot me first, she said, her voice shaking but resolute, tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Because I am not going back into silence. Iris's face crumpled. The fury drained out of her, leaving behind only a vast, desolate grief. The rifle wavered, then dropped until its barrel pointed at the ground. Willa, please, I can't lose you too. You're all I have left of her. I'm not her, Willa said, her voice softening with a pity that was more powerful than her anger. I am me, and I deserve a chance to make my own choices, even if they are the wrong ones. Boone saw the genuine love and terror warring in Iris's eyes. This wasn't malice. It was a fear so profound it had warped into control. Mrs. Quaid, he said carefully, let's find a compromise. Let Willa talk to me, but only with you present. You can stand guard. You can protect her, and she can still learn about the world. Iris looked up, suspicion and desperate hope mingling in her gaze. Willa turned to Boone, her eyes shining with possibility. You would do that talk to me with her watching every word, if it means you get to use your voice? He said, his gaze unwavering. I would. Iris was quiet for a long, torturous moment. At last, she let out a sigh that seemed to carry 20 years of weariness. One dinner. That's all. And if I see so much as a hint of Thomas Garrett in your eyes, you will never set foot near this cabin again. Agreed, Boone said instantly. And Willa Iris added, her voice stern. You do not go anywhere alone with him. Do you understand me? Willa nodded the compromise, a small but significant victory. Tomorrow evening, Iris said. Sunset. The cabin is in the old oak grove. And bring something for the meal. We are not charity. With that, she turned and marched back into the woods. When she was gone, Boone and Willa faced each other across the creek, the space between them now charged with a new, thrilling energy. I've never had dinner with a man before, Willa said, a slow smile spreading across her face. I've never had dinner under armed guard before, Boone replied. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard it, a sound as clear and bright as the creek water flowing at their feet. It was the sound of a cage door swinging open. And as the sound faded into the quiet of the valley, they both knew that tomorrow's dinner was more than a meal. It was the beginning of everything. Boone spent much of the next day not at his ranch, but exploring it. The story of Willa's mother, of a man who promised a new life and then vanished, echoed with a strange, unsettling familiarity. It reminded him of the whispers and rumors that had always surrounded his own family tragedy of land deals gone sour, of promises broken. He had always dismissed them as small-town gossip, clinging instead to the simple, brutal narrative of a robbery gone wrong. Now he wasn't so sure. He started in the main house, running his hands over the old furniture, searching for anything his predecessors might have left behind. It was in the cellar that he found it. Hidden beneath a stack of rotting burlap sacks in the far corner was a small tin lockbox rusted shut. He carried it up into the light and forced it open with the tip of his hunting knife. Inside, nestled amongst dried leaves and the skeletal remains of mice, was a collection of old leather-bound ledgers. Most were ruined by damp and time. The ink bled into illegible Rorschach blots. But one at the bottom of the box was partially preserved. The first few pages were a mess, but as he carefully turned the brittle pages, he found entries written in his father's familiar, elegant script. They were records of business transactions, land purchases, and supply costs. And on nearly every page, another name appeared alongside his father's, Silas Kane. Boone felt the blood drain from his face. It couldn't be a coincidence. His father and the man who wore his mother's locket had been partners. They had been buying up land together all throughout this region. As he read on, the entries grew more terse, the tone more strained. He found mentions of a dispute of arguments over shared access to a creek, the very creek that now separated his land from Iris and Willa's. The final legible entry was dated 2 days before his parents were murdered. B.S.K. threatens ruin. Claims I have stolen his family's future by diverting the water. He is a man unhinged by desperation. Must take precautions. The ledger slipped from Boone's numb fingers. The official story, the one the sheriff had told him, the one he had told himself for 15 years, was a lie. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was personal. It was a feud. Silas Kane hadn't just appeared in his life in redemption. He had been a ghost haunting it from the very beginning. And this land, this valley he had chosen as a random refuge, was at the very heart of it all. The knowledge settled in his gut like a shard of ice. He wasn't just waiting for a reckoning. He had been living on the battleground all along. He rode into town for supplies later that day, his mind reeling. The world felt tilted on its axis. At the general store, he saw the storekeeper, a portly, gossip-loving man named Murphy, talking in low tones with 2 other men. Boone's presence silenced them. Delaney Murphy set his tone a little too friendly. Back for more provisions, entertaining are we. Something for dinner, Boone replied noncommittally, grabbing a sack of flour and a few tins of beans. He added a bottle of wine, an extravagance he hadn't intended, but now felt necessary, a small shield of normalcy against the chaos churning inside him. As Murphy tallied the cost, he leaned in conspiratorially. Word is Silas Kane's been buying up property east of here, paying top dollar. Folks say he's trying to corner the water rights for the whole basin. Boone kept his face impassive. Is that so? Yes, sir. Man's got ambition. And a reputation for not taking no for an answer. Murphy's eyes glinted with a sly curiosity. You be careful up in that valley of yours. A man with a prime piece of land like that with its own creek. Well, he's bound to attract attention. The warning was clear. Kane was coming. And Murphy and his cronies were the town's weather vanes, pointing in the direction the wind was blowing. Boone returned to the ranch and prepared for the evening, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He shaved, put on his cleanest shirt, and polished his boots, the simple rituals of frail defense against the storm he knew was gathering. This dinner was no longer just about Willa's freedom. It was about understanding the full scope of the danger they were all in. He found the cabin nestled in a grove of ancient oaks. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a welcoming plume against the twilight sky. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Willa stood there, and the sight of her stole his breath. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that mirrored the evening sky and brought out the flecks of gold in her eyes. Her wheat-colored hair was braided with small wildflowers. She looked nervous and hopeful, and so achingly beautiful, it made his heart ache. "You came," she breathed, relief and joy warring in her voice. "I promised I would." Iris appeared behind her, a sentinel in black. She held no rifle, but her gaze was just as sharp. She looked Boone up and down, a flicker of grudging approval in her eyes. "You clean up decent enough. Come in. The food is getting cold." The cabin's interior was a single room, but it was cozy, warm, and immaculately clean. A small table was set for three, a mason jar of wildflowers at its center. It was the most civilized scene he had witnessed in years. Dinner began with a tense, formal politeness. Iris served a venison stew that was rich and savory, and Willa watched him, her eyes bright with questions she was still too hesitant to ask. Boone, his mind still on the ledger, and Kane forced himself to focus on the moment, on the young woman taking her first steps into a larger world. "Tell me about your ranch," she finally asked, her voice gaining strength. He talked about cattle and horses, about the good grazing land and plentiful water, but the words feeling hollow and false now that he knew the water itself was the source of a blood feud. In return, she spoke of her life in the woods. She described the books Iris brought her, the small garden she tended, the way she made paints from berry juice and charcoal to capture the images of the animals who were her only friends. As she spoke, she blossomed. Her initial shyness gave way to an infectious enthusiasm. She leaned forward, her hands describing the arc of a hawk's flight, her face animated and alive. She was not just a frightened girl. She was intelligent, artistic, and possessed of a deep, quiet strength. Boone found himself utterly captivated, the specter of Silas Kane momentarily forgotten. Iris watched them, her face a thundercloud of disapproval. Every time Willa laughed, every time her eyes met Boone's, the old woman's lips tightened. "That is enough talk," Iris announced, abruptly rising to clear the plates. "But we're not finished," Willa protested, her face falling. "We are finished enough." The disappointment in Willa's eyes was quickly replaced by a flash of the same defiance he'd seen at the creek. "Mr. Delaney," she said, her tone formal, but her gaze firm. "Perhaps you would like to see my garden before you leave. It is just behind the cabin." She glanced at Iris, in full view of the window. The silent battle of wills between them was palpable. Finally, with a curt nod, Iris conceded, 5 minutes, and the door stays open." The garden was a small miracle of order and beauty carved from the wilderness. Neat rows of vegetables grew alongside carefully tended wildflowers. "It's beautiful," Willa Boone said, and he meant it. "You have a gift." They walked to the far end of the garden, the lamplight from the cabin window a warm, watchful eye. Willa stopped and turned to him. "Boone," she said, his name a soft intimacy on her lips. "Tonight, this was the happiest I have ever been." Before he could find the words to respond, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. The touch was light, innocent, but it sent a shockwave through him. "I know Iris is afraid," she whispered, her voice urgent. "But I am not my mother. And you are not Thomas Garrett." They stood close, the scent of wildflowers and wood smoke mingling in the cool night air. The world narrowed to the space between them, a fragile bubble of peace. It was shattered by the sound of approaching horses, not one but several moving fast with a hard, purposeful rhythm. Willa's face went pale. "Someone is coming," she whispered, her hand tightening on his arm. "Someone who shouldn't be here." 3 riders burst into the clearing. Boone recognized them instantly. Murphy from the general store, flanked by the 2 men he'd been talking with. They carried rifles across their saddles, and their faces were hard and ugly in the moonlight. "Evening," Delaney Murphy called out, his voice thick with false bonhomie. "Didn't take you for the type to be visiting the local hermits after dark." Iris was instantly in the doorway, her own rifle in her hands. "You have no business here. This is private property." "Actually, ma'am, we do." One of the men sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Willa's flowers. "The good folk of redemption are concerned. We've come to investigate what sort of unnatural business you're conducting up here in the shadows." Boone moved, placing himself between them and Willa. "There's nothing to investigate. Leave them be." "Decent people don't hide from the world," Delaney Murphy said, swinging down from his horse. "Decent people don't raise a young girl away from God and society." The other man leered openly at Willa. An unmarried woman living alone with another woman. A strange man visiting at night. It don't take much imagination to picture the sinfulness happening here. "You will watch your tongue," Iris warned her rifle rock steady. Or what the third man, a brute with scarred knuckles, laughed as he dismounted. "You gonna shoot 3 upstanding citizens for trying to save this poor girl from a life of depravity? I think it's time someone taught you women some proper respect." He took a menacing step toward Willa. In that instant, the clearing erupted. Iris's rifle swung to track the man. Boone's Colt was in his hand, clearing the leather with a whisper of deadly intent. And Willa, the girl who had never spoken to a man, who had lived her life in fear, grabbed a heavy garden spade, held it like a weapon, and stepped forward to stand beside Boone. "Nobody," she said, her voice shaking but filled with a cold, clear fury, "talks about my family that way." The standoff was absolute. 3 armed men versus 2 rifles, a pistol, and a garden spade, held by a woman who had finally found her courage. Murphy looked from the guns to Willa's defiant face, and then to the cold, dead certainty in Boone's eyes. Whatever he saw there made him pause. This was not the easy intimidation he had planned. "This ain't over," he grumbled, but the conviction had gone from his voice. "You're right," Boone said, his voice quiet and deadly. "It's just beginning. Get off this land, and if you ever come back, you'll be carried out." The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances, then mounted their horses and retreated into the darkness, their bravado curdling into muttered threats. Silence descended on the clearing, thick and profound. Iris slowly lowered her rifle. Boone holstered his pistol. Willa's spade clattered to the ground as her trembling hands gave out. Iris looked from Willa to Boone, her face etched with a complex mix of emotions. "I have spent 20 years trying to protect her from the world," she said, her voice heavy with revelation. "I was wrong. The world is what she needed to find her strength." She turned to Boone. "You put yourself in danger for her. A man does not do that unless he cares." "I do," Boone said simply, his eyes never leaving Willa. "Then God help you both." Iris sighed, looking every one of her years. She turned and went back into the cabin, closing the door softly behind her, leaving them alone. The crisis had burned away all pretense, all hesitation. "I was terrified," Willa confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "You were magnificent," Boone told her, stepping closer and taking her trembling hands in his. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "I found more than my voice tonight, Boone. I found my courage, and I know what I want." "What is that?" "I want to marry you." She said the words simple, direct, and utterly shocking. "Not because of them or Iris or what's proper, but because I choose it. Because I choose you." Boone's heart seemed to stop, then restart with a powerful surge. "Willa, you barely know me." "I know enough," she insisted, her grip tightening on his hands. "I know you are kind. I know you are brave. I know that when I am with you, I am not afraid. That is more than my mother ever had. It is everything I could ever want." He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Then yes," he whispered. Yes, to all of it. He kissed her. Then a kiss that was not about passion, but about promise. A promise of partnership, of shared burdens of a life built together against a world that would try to tear them apart. When they broke apart, Willa was smiling a radiant, confident smile that transformed her face. So, she said, a playful light in her eyes, what does a bride who has never spoken to a man before say to her husband-to-be? Whatever she wants, Boone answered, his heart full, for the rest of her life. But even as he held her, the cold knowledge of the ledger and Silas Kane was a shadow at the edge of his joy. Their life together wouldn't begin with a quiet peace. It would begin with a war. The days that followed were a strange mixture of idyllic peace and tense preparation. Willa began spending her days at the ranch, her laughter echoing in rooms that had only known silence. Under Iris's watchful but now approving eye, she and Boone worked side by side their movements, falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. They repaired the roof of the barn, cleared a larger plot for a garden, and started to turn the ghost ranch into a home. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, and Willa would talk, unleashing a torrent of questions and observations, a lifetime of thoughts finally given voice. Boone, in turn, found himself speaking of his past, not the war, but the small, happy memories of his family, before the tragedy exorcising his ghosts by giving them to her. But beneath the surface of this newfound domesticity, the threat of Silas Kane loomed. Boone taught Willa how to handle a pistol. She was a natural, her artist's eye giving her a steady hand and an uncanny aim. They fortified the ranch house, reinforcing the doors and shuttering the windows. Iris, for her part, patrolled the perimeter of the valley, like a she-wolf guarding her territory, her old rifle a constant companion. They were a family forged in crisis, preparing for a storm. The storm came sooner than they expected. It began not with riders, but with the sky, which turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The air grew heavy, and still the birds fell silent, and a low moan began to rise from the canyons, the telltale sound of an approaching sandstorm. "Get inside," Boone ordered, his eyes on the horizon, where a monstrous, roiling wall of brown dust was advancing upon them. "Both of you." They scrambled to secure the animals in the barn and barricade themselves in the house just as the first wave of sand hit. The world outside disappeared. The sun was blotted out. Day turned to an eerie, suffocating twilight. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and sand fine as flour began to force its way through every crack and crevice, coating everything in a gritty film. The storm was a force of nature, primal and terrifying. But it was not the only enemy they faced. Through a small gap in one of the window shutters, Boone saw them. Figures on horseback, barely visible through the swirling curtain of dust. At least 5 of them moving slowly, using the storm as cover. And leading them, a tall, confident figure whose silhouette was unmistakable. Silas Kane had come. "He's here," Boone said, his voice grim. "Willa, get to the back room with Iris. Stay away from the windows." "No," Willa said, picking up her pistol. Her face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. "I stood behind you once. This time I stand with you." Iris nodded, cocking her rifle. "She's right. This is our home. We defend it together." The first gunshot cracked through the howl of the wind, splintering the wood of the front door. The siege had begun. The fight was a chaotic nightmare. Visibility was reduced to a few feet. The storm was a deafening, disorienting roar. Shapes moved in the dust muzzle flashes, and the only points of light in the maelstrom. Boone, Willa, and Iris moved from window to window, firing at the fleeting targets, their shots carefully aimed, conserving ammunition. Kane's men were less disciplined, firing wildly at the house, their bullets thudding into the thick log walls. An hour crawled by, each minute an eternity of noise and fear. one of Cain's men got too close, trying to smash a window with his rifle butt. Iris's shot was swift and true. The man screamed and fell back, disappearing into the storm. They heard Cain's cultured voice bellowing orders, trying to rally his men against the unexpectedly fierce resistance. Then there was a crash of glass from the side of the house, followed by a grunt of pain. Iris Willis screamed. Boone rushed into the small kitchen to see Iris slumped against the wall, blood pouring from a deep gash in her shoulder. A bullet had come through the window, shattering the glass and spraying her with shrapnel. "It's just a scratch," the old woman gasped, but her face was ashen. "We have to stop the bleeding," Willa said, her voice tight with panic, as she tore strips from her apron. The assault on the house intensified. They were down a gun, and Cain knew it. Boone knew they couldn't hold out for much longer. He had to end this. "Stay with her," he told Willa. "Keep pressure on the wound. Don't let them through that door." He moved to the front of the house, his mind racing. He couldn't fight them all. He had to get to Cain. He unbolted the heavy front door and, using the cover of a particularly violent gust of wind, slipped outside. The world was a blinding, stinging chaos. He pressed himself against the wall of the house, the wind trying to tear him away. He could just make out two of Cain's men moving toward the barn. He raised his Colt, sighted down the barrel, and fired twice. The figures dropped. He heard a shout of rage from the other side of the yard. "Delaney. You coward, face me." It was Cain. Boone moved low and fast, circling around the back of the house, using the storm as his ally. He found Cain near the well, his face wrapped in a bandana, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "It's just you and me now," Cain Boone yelled over the wind. "It was always just you and me," Cain roared back, raising his pistol. They fired at the same time. Boone felt a searing pain rip through his left arm, spinning him around. Cain grunted and staggered back, clutching his side. Both wounded, they stared at each other through the swirling sand, two ghosts locked in a generational battle. Cain lunged, not with his gun, but with a primal fury. He tackled Boone, and they went down in the dust, wrestling for control of Boone's pistol. Cain was stronger, his hands like vices, but Boone was a survivor. He twisted, bringing his knee up hard into Cain's wounded side. Cain roared in pain, his grip loosening just enough. Boone scrambled back, raising his pistol, its aim wavering. Cain was on his knees, breathing heavily, blood seeping through his fingers. Why, Boone gasped, the pain in his arm, a white-hot fire. The locket. My parents. Why? Cain looked up, and through the dust and pain, Boone saw not just hatred, but a profound, bottomless grief. Cain laughed, a terrible, broken sound. "Your father wasn't the saint you remember?" He screamed, his voice raw. "He was a thief. We were partners. This valley, this water. It was supposed to be ours, for our families. But he cheated me. He forged my name on a new deed, diverted the creek to his own property, and left my land barren. He left my family to starve." The confession hit Boone harder than the bullet. The half-burned ledger, the cryptic final entry, it all crashed into place. My wife, my little girl. They died that winter because of his greed. Cain's voice broke the cultured baritone, gone, replaced by the anguish of a ruined man. He took everything from me, so I took everything from him. His life, his wife. And this. He ripped the silver locket from his neck, the chain snapping. "This was supposed to be for my daughter. Your father stole my daughter's future, so I took his wife's memento." The world tilted again. This wasn't a battle of good versus evil. It was a tragedy. A story of two families destroyed by the sins of their fathers. Boone stared at the man who had murdered his parents, and for the first time, he saw not a monster, but a mirror of his own loss. In that moment of stunned silence, a shape emerged from the storm behind Cain. It was Willa. Her face was a mask of grim determination, and in her hands she held Iris's heavy hunting rifle. She didn't hesitate. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, its report a deafening crack that momentarily silenced the wind. Silas Cain's eyes went wide with surprise. He looked down at the new dark stain spreading across his chest, then back at Boone. He fell forward into the dust without another word. Willa rushed to Boone's side, her eyes wild with fear and relief. "Are you hurt?" "I'll live." He grunted, clutching his arm. The sandstorm began to lose its fury, the wind's shriek lessening to a mournful sigh. The brown curtain started to lift, revealing the devastation. The battle was over. The silence that followed the storm was more profound than any that had come before. The wind died, the dust settled, and the valley was reborn into a world washed clean and grimly quiet. Cain and his men lay where they had fallen, stark monuments to a feud that had spanned a generation. Inside the ranch house, the air was thick with the scent of blood and spent gunpowder. Willa, her hand steady now, finished binding Boone's arm. The bullet had passed clean through the flesh, a painful but not a mortal wound. Iris lay on a cot, pale but conscious, the bleeding in her shoulders stanched. The three of them, a battered and bruised family, were alive. In the days that followed, they worked in a quiet, somber rhythm. Boone buried the dead on a distant hill, giving them unmarked graves. It was a grim task, but a necessary one. As he covered Silas Cain's body with the last shovelful of earth, he felt not triumph, but a vast, weary emptiness. Cain's revelation had shattered the bedrock of his past, leaving him untethered. His father, the man he had idolized, was no saint. He was a man whose ambition had led to the destruction of two families. He sat on the porch that evening, the silver locket heavy in his hand. Willa came and sat beside him, taking his uninjured hand in hers. She didn't speak, simply offering her presence as an anchor in his sea of confusion. "Everything I thought I knew was a lie," he said finally, his voice rough. "My whole life I've been avenging a saint who never existed." "Your father's choices are not yours, Boone," she said, her voice soft but firm. "His sins are not your legacy. What he did, what Cain did, that was their story. It's over now. We build our own legacy, starting now, right here." She was right. The past was a ghost, and he could choose to let it haunt him, or he could let it go. The next morning, he saddled his horse. He rode out of the valley, the locket tucked safely in his pocket. He journeyed for 2 days back to the small forgotten cemetery where his parents were buried. He stood before the 2 weathered headstones, the names Margaret and John Delaney barely legible. He had carried this quest for revenge for 15 years. It had defined him, hollowed him out, and driven him to the edge of the world. Now it was over, and the truth of it was just a bitter, tragic waste. He dug a small hole at the foot of his father's grave. He looked at the silver locket one last time, at the 2 nesting doves that were supposed to symbolize peace. Then he placed it in the earth and covered it over. He was burying it all, the idealized memory, the painful truth, the anger, and the need for vengeance. He was leaving the ghosts behind. When he returned to the valley, he felt lighter than he had in years. As he rode into the yard, Willa came out onto the porch, a worried line on her brow that smoothed into a relieved smile when she saw him. He dismounted and walked toward her. He didn't need to say a word. She saw the change in his eyes, the peace that had finally settled there. The war was over. He took her in his arms, breathing in the scent of her hair, of wildflowers and home. "It's done," he whispered. "I know," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. She pulled back slightly, a shy, hopeful smile on her face. She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "Our story is just beginning," she said. Beneath his palm, he felt the faintest whisper of a new life, a clean slate, a future free from the sins of the past. The ghost ranch was no longer a place of endings, but the cradle of a new beginning built not on a legacy of vengeance, but on the quiet, unshakable foundation of their love.